The first time Jonas McCrae heard the crack of iron against bone, he thought it was a gunshot, and his hand dropped to the Colt at his hip before he even had a chance to think it through. He had ridden 3 days through the blistering Texas heat to reach the small settlement of Caldwell Crossing, a dust-choked little place that sat at the crossroads of two cattle trails about 40 miles south of Abilene. It was 1883, and the Kansas plains were not what they used to be. The wild, lawless stretch of open range had been slowly fenced and tamed by barbed wire and railroad contracts. But the men who lived out here were not always tamed along with it. Jonas knew that better than most. He had spent half his life riding through places like this, through sun-scorched towns with no names worth remembering, asking questions that nobody wanted to answer. He had been looking for her for 20 years. Thomas McCrae had died in the autumn of 1863, shot off his horse during a skirmish along the Missouri border when the war was still young and stupid, and full of promises it never intended to keep. Jonas had been 16 years old, too young to fight alongside his brother, but old enough to watch him ride away and never come back. By the time word reached their mother in Tennessee, Thomas had already been in the ground 2 months. And by the time Jonas was old enough to go looking, the woman Thomas had married in secret, a girl named Martha Turner, whom Jonas had never met and only knew from a single letter Thomas had written in the spring of 1862, had vanished like smoke in a canyon wind. 20 years. Jonas was 36 now, with silver threading through his dark hair at the temples and a tiredness behind his eyes that had nothing to do with the distance he had ridden. He had tracked leads across Missouri and Arkansas, through Oklahoma territory and down into Texas. He had found dead ends in every state and territory between the Mississippi River and the Rockies. He had found women who were not her, graves that might have been her, trails that went cold before they went anywhere useful. 3 different times he had gotten close enough to feel it in his chest, only to have the truth come apart in his hands like wet paper. He did not know exactly why he kept looking. Some nights, lying under a sky full of stars with his saddle for a pillow, he told himself it was because of a promise. That on the night before Thomas rode off to war, his older brother had pressed his hand and said, "If something happens to me, Jonas, you look after Martha. She is alone in this world and she does not know it yet." Other nights, Jonas was honest enough with himself to admit that the promise had become something else over the years, something harder to name. It had become the thread that kept him moving when everything else said stop. He had gotten the most recent lead from a land office clerk in Wichita, a thin-necked man named Prout, who remembered processing a deed transfer 7 years back for a widow woman named Turner who had bought a quarter section east of Caldwell Crossing. The deed had been filed under the name M. Turner, and the clerk remembered it specifically because the woman had paid in cash gold coin, which was unusual enough to stick in his memory. Jonas had ridden south with nothing but that and the description Prout had given him. Dark hair going gray, brown eyes, strong hands, spoke like she was educated but lived like she was not afraid of work. That description could have fit 100 women in Kansas. But he was here, and the sun was going down, and the sound that had stopped him in the middle of the main street of Caldwell Crossing had not been a gunshot at all. It had been a cast iron skillet connecting with the side of a man's head. The scene unfolding in the narrow alley beside the dry goods store was not one that required much interpretation. 3 men, rough types, trail-worn and clearly drunk even at this hour of the early evening, had cornered a woman against the back wall of the building. One of them was already on the ground, clutching the side of his head and making a sound like a calf that had just been branded. The other 2 were circling, and the woman standing between them and the wall was holding a cast iron skillet in both hands like she intended to use it again, and was not the least bit uncertain about the matter. She was not young, but she was not old either, somewhere in her 40s, Jonas guessed, with dark hair that had gone silver-gray at the temples and was pinned up under a plain cotton bonnet that had come half loose in the scuffle. Her dress was practical and faded, the kind a woman wore when she had work to do and no patience for fashion. Her boots were caked with dried mud, and her eyes, brown, sharp, absolutely without fear, were fixed on the two remaining men with an expression that said she had been through worse than this and had come out the other side standing. "I said get away from me," she said, and her voice was clear and steady, the kind of voice that had been used to giving orders in empty places where there was nobody else to do the giving. "The next one of you that comes close gets the other side of this pan, and I promise you that side is heavier." The taller of the two men laughed, though there was nothing genuinely amused in it. "Lady, you got lucky once. Put that thing down before you make us angry." "I have not been lucky a single day in 20 years, the woman said. "I do not intend to start now. The pan stays." Jonas had already swung down from his horse by the time she said it. He looped the reins loosely over the hitching post at the alley's entrance and walked forward, not hurrying, not drawing his weapon, just moving with the particular kind of calm that had a way of announcing itself in a room or an alley before the man carrying it arrived. "Evening," he said. The two standing men turned. The one on the ground stopped making noise and started paying attention instead. "This is a private matter," the tall one said. "It stopped being private when you made it happen in a public alley," Jonas said. He glanced at the woman, who had not lowered the skillet by so much as an inch. "You all right, ma'am?" "I was managing," she said, and there was a cool edge to it that told him she meant it. She was not grateful precisely, she had not needed saving and she knew it, and she wanted him to know she knew it. But there was something else in her expression too, a quick, careful assessment of him, the way a woman who had been alone a long time learned to assess strangers, deciding in 3 seconds whether he was trouble or something else. "I can see that," Jonas said, and he meant that too. The tall man took a step toward Jonas, and Jonas turned to face him fully for the first time. Whatever the man saw in Jonas's face, the steadiness of it, maybe, or the way his hand rested near his holster without being dramatic about it, made him stop. He looked at his companion. His companion looked at the man still on the ground. The man on the ground sat up and spat blood. "This ain't worth it," the man on the ground said, which was the most sensible thing any of them had managed all evening. The tall man pointed a finger at the woman. "You broke Clem's ear," he said, as though this were a formal accusation that required a response. "His ear will heal," she said. "His manners clearly will not. Now get off my property. The street in front of this store is mine by right of the deed I hold on it, and if you are still within 20 feet of me when I count to 10, I will file a complaint with the county sheriff, and I will make sure every man in this town knows you were run off by a woman with a cooking pan." There was a long silence. Then the 3 men gathered themselves up, 2 on their feet, one still unsteady, and left the alley without another word. Jonas watched them go until they turned a corner and disappeared. Then he turned back to the woman. She was lowering the skillet now, slowly, as though the moment she let her guard down she had to immediately replace it with something else. She pressed her free hand flat against the wall of the building behind her for just a moment, steadying herself, not because she was weak, but because the body did what it needed to do after something like that, whether you wanted it to or not. "They will be back," Jonas said. "They have been back before," she said. She straightened and looked at him properly for the first time. "I do not believe I know you." "Jonas McCrae," he said. Something moved across her face. It was small and fast and complicated, the way feelings were when they were too large to fit into an expression. She went very still. "McCrae," she repeated. "Yes, ma'am." "Thomas McCrae's brother," she said, and it was not a question. "Yes." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of 20 years and all the weight those years carried. She looked at him the way you looked at someone you had given up expecting to see, not with disbelief, because she had moved past the age of disbelief, but with something slower and more complicated. Recognition, maybe, or the end of a very long waiting. "You look like him," she said finally, and her voice was different now. Quieter around the eyes. "People used to say that," Jonas said. She looked at him for another moment, then she did something unexpected. She laughed. It was brief and a little rough, like a sound that had not been used in a while, but it was genuine, the laugh of a woman who recognized the absurdity of the universe when it showed up on her doorstep. 20 years, she said, and you show up on the one evening I decide to confront Harcourt Briggs about the water rights he has been stealing from my land for 3 seasons. She held up the skillet. I forgot the pan was still in my hand when I walked over here. Lucky that I did. Lucky for Clem's ear, maybe, Jonas said. She laughed again, and this time it came easier. Her name was Martha Turner, and she had been Thomas McCrae's wife for exactly 14 months before he went off to fight for the Confederacy and did not come back. She had been 19 years old when they married, 20 when he left, 21 when they sent her the letter. She was 42 now, and she had spent the years between building something out of almost nothing in a place that had tried, on more than one occasion, to take even the nothing away from her. She told Jonas some of this over supper, a meal she cooked herself in the kitchen behind the dry goods store, which was also her store, her property, and the center of her not inconsiderable commercial enterprise in Caldwell Crossing. The store was well stocked and neatly kept, the back room warm from the stove, the table set with plain dishes that were clean and unchipped. She was a woman who had made her circumstances deliberate, Jonas thought. Everything in this room had been chosen or built or earned. Nothing was here by accident. He had his hat off and was sitting across the table from her, watching her move between the stove and the table with the easy efficiency of someone who had done the same thing 1,000 times and found comfort in the repetition. She had unpinned her hair at some point, and it fell to her shoulders, dark and streaked with silver, and it was different from anything he had imagined in all the years of imagining. He had imagined her. He realized that now. In 20 years of looking, he had built an idea of her out of what Thomas had written kind. He had said, and funny, and not afraid of anything. He had not imagined the silver in her hair or the way she carried herself like someone who had been tested by the world and had simply refused to be broken by it. He had not imagined the sharpness of her eyes or the way her hands moved with such absolute confidence over everything they touched. "You did not have to come looking," she said, setting a plate of beans and cornbread in front of him and taking her seat. "Thomas has been gone a long time." "I know," Jonas said. The looking was not entirely for his sake. She tilted her head slightly. "What do you mean?" He thought about how to say it. "He asked me to look after you, the night before he left. I was 16, too young to go with him, so I stayed behind and he made me promise. I did not know what that promise would look like over 20 years. I thought it would be simple." He picked up his fork, then set it down again. "It was not simple. Nothing Thomas McCrae touched was ever simple," she said, "and there was both affection and resignation in it, the way you spoke about someone you had loved honestly, including all the complications." "Did you know he wrote to me about you?" Jonas said. She shook her head. "I did not know he had a brother until the letter came. His family was in Tennessee. It was such a long way away. We were living in Missouri then on his cousin's farm, and when I got the letter about Thomas, the cousin's family made it plain that they did not consider me family. I packed what I could carry and I left." She said it plainly without bitterness, though Jonas heard the bitterness underneath. "I came west. It was the logical direction." "How long have you been here?" "Caldwell Crossing," she considered. 12 years. I was in Dodge City before that, working in a hotel. Before that I was in a place called Millhaven in western Kansas. That does not exist anymore because the railroad went the other direction, and the town folded up and blew away." She almost smiled. "I have been a great many places, Jonas McCrae." "So have I," he said. They ate in a silence that was not uncomfortable, which surprised him a little. He had expected it to be awkward. 20 years of searching ending in a kitchen over a plate of beans was not exactly the reunion he had pictured, whatever he had pictured, but it was not awkward. It was oddly easy, in the way that sometimes a conversation with a complete stranger was easier than a conversation with someone who knew you, because there was no history to navigate, only the present. Except there was history. There was Thomas, who sat between them at the table without sitting there at all, just a presence made of old letters and older grief and the particular weight of people who were gone too young. He was a good man, Jonas said eventually. He was, Martha agreed. He was also stubborn, reckless, and convinced that being charming was the same as being right. She looked up. You have the look of him. Are you also those things? Jonas considered this seriously. I am told I am stubborn, he said. I have not been called charming in recent memory. That is either very honest or very concerning, she said, and the way her eyes caught the lamplight when she said it did something unexpected to the space between his ribs. He told himself that was natural. She was Thomas's wife. She was a woman he had been thinking about for 2 decades. Of course there was feeling in seeing her finally. That was all it was. He told himself that several more times over the following 3 days, during which he found reasons to stay in Caldwell Crossing that had very little to do with his original purpose. He told himself it was because of the problem with Harcourt Briggs and the water rights, which was a real problem, a legitimate one that deserved attention. Briggs was a rancher with 700 acres to the north of Martha's quarter section, and a long-standing habit of diverting the creek that crossed both properties to favor his cattle operation, which left Martha's kitchen garden and small livestock operation perpetually short of water through the dry months. It was the kind of dispute that could turn ugly, and the 3 men in the alley, Clem and the tall one and the third one, whose name turned out to be Price, were all Briggs's hired hands. The confrontation had not been random. It had been a warning, the kind Briggs had apparently been sending with increasing regularity and decreasing subtlety. He wants the land, Martha explained, on the morning of Jonas's second day in Caldwell Crossing. They were standing at the back edge of her property, where the kitchen garden gave way to a stretch of dry grassland that ran down to the creek, or to where the creek would have been, if Briggs had not had his men build a timber dam 2 miles upstream 3 months before. The creek bed was dry now, cracked mud and bleached rocks, and the sight of it made Martha's expression go tight in a way that was worse than anger. It was the face of someone watching something they had built being slowly taken apart. He has been trying to buy me out for 4 years, she continued. When I would not sell, he started with the water. When the water did not break me, he sent those men. Has the sheriff been involved? Martha made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Sheriff Connolly takes his coffee at Briggs's ranch every Tuesday morning. Has done for 6 years. She glanced at Jonas. I filed a complaint last spring. The response was that the creek had been diverted for legitimate agricultural purposes, and that any claim of property damage would need to be proved in a court of law in Wichita. Can you prove it? I have the deed and I have the land survey from 1876, which shows the water rights running with my property. What I do not have is the money to hire a lawyer in Wichita and fight it through the courts, which Briggs knows perfectly well. She crossed her arms. He is betting that I will run out of patience before he runs out of resources. He does not know you very well, Jonas said. She looked at him sideways, and something in her expression shifted, not quite softening, not yet, but acknowledging something. You have known me 3 days, she said. I have known about you for 20 years, Jonas said. Thomas wrote things about you that I read so many times I could recite them. He paused because he had not intended to say that and was not sure what to do with it now that it was out. He knew you well. The expression on Martha's face was difficult to read, layered, careful, the way faces got when something had been touched that was both precious and painful. She looked back at the dry creek bed. He did, she said quietly. He did know me. Jonas stayed. He told himself he would help resolve the water rights situation and then he would leave, because what else was there to do? His promise to Thomas had been fulfilled. He had found her. She was alive. She was clearly not in need of being looked after in any way that insulted her considerable self-sufficiency. He could go back to Tennessee, or to wherever the next thing was, but he kept finding reasons. There was the water rights dispute, which he pursued on her behalf, riding to Wichita on the 4th day of his stay, and presenting himself at the land office with a copy of Martha's original deed and the survey documentation she had kept meticulous hold of in a tin box under her bed. He spent 2 days in Wichita talking to lawyers and to a sympathetic county official who had his own reasons for finding Briggs troublesome, and he came back with something useful: an injunction requiring Briggs to restore the creek flow pending a formal hearing, and the name of a lawyer in Wichita who was willing to take the case on a contingency basis against the evidence Martha could provide. Martha stood in the doorway of her store and read the injunction 3 times when he handed it to her, and then she looked up at him with an expression that he had not seen on her face before. Not the sharpness or the humor or the careful assessment she usually wore. Something more open. "How did you manage this?" she said. "I was persuasive," Jonas said. "You were gone for 2 days and you came back with a legal injunction," she said. "Jonas McCrae, that is more than persuasion." "I also found the county assessor had his own dispute with Briggs over an unpaid tax assessment from 1880, Jonas admitted. "That helped." She looked at him for a long moment. Then, with the care of someone who was not accustomed to laning, she reached out and touched his arm just briefly, the tips of her fingers on his forearm, there and gone again. "Thank you," she said. It was such a simple thing. 2 words, the light touch of her hand. He had been thanked before many times for many things. But this sat differently in him, in a place that had been empty for a long time and was therefore more aware of the filling. That night he sat on the front step of the boarding house where he had taken a room and tried to have an honest conversation with himself. It was a conversation he had been avoiding for several days, and he was not particularly enjoying it now. He was attracted to her. That was simply the truth of it, plain and without decoration. He had admired her from the first moment in the alley, her courage, her composure, the absolute certainty with which she held that cast iron skillet, and admiration had moved into something warmer over the past week, fed by meals and conversations, and the way she laughed at things that were genuinely funny and not at things that were not, and the way she talked about her land and her business with a passion that was not performed but simply present, just part of who she was. But she was Thomas's wife. Widow, she had been Thomas's wife. Jonas turned that over for a long time under the Kansas stars. The night was warm, insects singing in the grass along the road, a dog barking somewhere at the edge of town. He thought about Thomas, 21 years old when he died, full of life and carelessness, and the particular brightness of someone who had never yet had reason to be afraid. He thought about the letter Thomas had written. "She is everything good, Jonas. She is the kind of person who makes the world make sense. You would love her if you knew her." He had read that line so many times it had worn into him like a groove worn in wood by a rope. He had thought it was Thomas speaking about his wife, with the particular exaggeration of a man in love. He had not considered that it might simply be accurate. He went to bed and did not sleep well, and in the morning he was quiet in a way that Martha noticed. "You are thinking very loudly," she said, over coffee. She had developed a habit of bringing him coffee when he came to help her with the morning inventory, which had somehow become part of his routine without being decided upon. The store opened at 7, and he had taken to being there at 6:30, moving crates and checking stock in a way that had started as practical assistance and had become something else. "I apologize," he said. "Do not apologize. I am just curious about the thought." She was measuring out dried beans into a cloth sack, her hands moving without her needing to look at them. "You have been somewhere else for the last hour," he debated. Then he decided that honesty was the thing he was best at, and also, in this case, the only option that did not feel like cowardice. "I have been thinking about the fact that I am not ready to leave," he said, "and trying to decide what to do about that." Her hand stilled on the bean scoop. "Why would you leave?" "Because I came to find you and make sure you were all right," he said. "Which I have done. You are more than all right. You have built something remarkable here, and you do not need me hovering about." She was quiet for a moment. Then she set the scoop down and turned to look at him fully, with that direct brown gaze that he had decided was one of the most compelling things he had ever encountered. "You came to fulfill a promise to a dead man," she said, "and you have done that. What I am asking is whether there is something else that wants to keep you here, something that has nothing to do with Thomas." The directness of it caught him off guard, though it should not have. He had learned by now that Martha Turner did not circle around things. She walked straight at them with the same energy she had walked toward those men in the alley, which was to say, without hesitation and with a cast iron pan. "Yes," he said, "there is." "Good," she said, and turned back to her beans, and that was the beginning of something different. It was not simple because nothing was simple, and Martha was not a woman who pretended otherwise. There was the matter of Thomas between them, which neither of them ignored. They talked about him, actually talked about him, in a way that was different from the careful avoidances of the first few days. She told Jonas about their marriage, the 14 months, the small farm in Missouri, the early mornings when Thomas would try to coax her into fishing when she had 100 other things to do, and the way he laughed when she inevitably gave in and came along. She told Jonas about the last time she had seen him, riding down the road on a borrowed horse with his hat pushed back on his head and his hand raised in goodbye, and how she had known, without being told, that the gesture was final. "I cried for a year," she said. They were walking along the restored creek. The injunction had been enforced 2 weeks in, and Briggs's men had been made to remove the dam, and the water had come back clear and cold and beautiful, and Martha had stood at the bank and watched it with an expression that Jonas had not been able to look away from. "Not in front of people. I did not have the luxury of grieving openly, but I cried for a year. Then I stopped, because I had to, and I started making decisions about what came next." "You were 21, Jonas said. "Yes, too young to know that it was hard. I only found out later how hard it had been." She glanced at him. "Does it bother you to talk about him this way?" "No," Jonas said, and meant it. "It helps, actually. He was real to me mostly as a memory. Hearing about who he was when he was living, it makes him more solid." "He would have liked you," Martha said. "He talked about you, you know. Not in letters. I did not know about the letters until later. But in those 14 months, he talked about his little brother who was too stubborn to be told anything and too smart to ignore." Jonas laughed. "That sounds accurate." "He was proud of you," she said simply. "He told me that you were going to be someone, Jonas McCrae. He said you had the kind of quiet in you that good men were made from." He did not know what to say to that, and so he said nothing, and they walked along the creek bank in the warm afternoon and listened to the water finding its way back. The Briggs situation came to a head in the 3rd week of Jonas's stay, which was also the week he had told himself, every single morning, that he would be leaving by the end of. He had not left. He had instead acquired, by some process he could not entirely account for, a cot in the back room of the dry goods store, technically on the grounds that he was helping Martha manage the inventory and the water rights hearing, and the general business of running a commercial enterprise while also keeping an eye out for further trouble from Briggs's direction. The trouble came on a Thursday evening, when 3 different trouble came riding in. Not the same 3 from the alley, though Clem and his damaged ear were among them. There were 5 riders this time, and they stopped in front of the dry goods store at the kind of hour that was designed to be ominous. Jonas had heard them coming. He had good ears and good instincts, and he was standing on the store's front porch with his arms folded and his expression perfectly calm when they pulled up. "Briggs wants to talk," said the man at the front, who was not any of the 3 from the alley. He was older, bigger, with a face that had clearly been in the path of things that wanted to hurt it. His name, Jonas would later learn, was Doyle, and he was Briggs's ranch foreman and the most competent person in Briggs's employ. "Tell Briggs to come himself," Jonas said. "I do not negotiate with messengers." "He is not offering a negotiation," Doyle said. "Then he can tell me what he is offering in person," Jonas said, "since he is apparently a man of sufficient confidence to send 5 riders to deliver a message to 1 man on a porch." Doyle looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the porch behind Jonas, where Martha had appeared in the doorway, not with the skillet this time, but with the double-barreled shotgun she kept under the counter, which was a more appropriate tool for this particular situation. 5-2, Doyle said. I can count, Jonas said. Can you count the number of complaints already filed with the Wichita Land Office regarding your employer's conduct? Because I can tell you that it is now 7. One more incident and the Federal Land Commissioner's office gets involved, and that is a level of attention that Harcourt Briggs does not want, given that 3 of those complaints have been corroborated by independent witnesses. Doyle's jaw tightened. He was smart enough to know when he was talking to someone who had done their homework, and he did not like it. We will be back, he said. Only if Briggs wants to come himself and have a conversation like a civilized man, Jonas said. Otherwise, the next time you show up here with intentions that are not shopping-related, I file complaint number 8 and include the date, the time, and the names of everyone currently sitting on those horses. He paused. I have a good memory for faces. The 5 riders left. Martha lowered the shotgun. You did not need me to come out, she said. No, Jonas agreed. But I was glad you did. She looked at him, and in the evening light her expression was something he did not quite have a word for yet. He was working on finding the word. He thought about it most of the remaining night, after they had locked up the store and she had gone inside, and he had sat on the porch steps listening to the sounds of Caldwell Crossing settling into sleep. Harcourt Briggs himself appeared 2 days later, which was a Friday morning in early September when the air had finally begun to lose the worst of the summer's heat, and there was something cool and clear about the sky that Jonas privately thought was one of the better things about Kansas. Briggs was a thick man in his mid-50s, well-dressed in the manner of a man who wanted people to know he was successful without wanting to appear to be trying. He had a politician's handshake and a rancher's eyes quick, evaluating, measuring everything in terms of what it was worth and how difficult it would be to acquire. He arrived alone, which was either a concession or a calculation, and he came into the dry goods store with his hat in his hands and his most reasonable expression deployed like a weapon. Martha watched him come in with the stillness of a woman who had been anticipating this for a long time and had decided exactly how it was going to go. Mrs. Turner, Briggs said, I believe we have gotten off on a poor footing. I believe you have been stealing my water and sending men to intimidate me, Martha said pleasantly. That is quite a poor footing, yes. Briggs's reasonable expression flickered. He looked at Jonas, who was standing near the back of the store with his thumbs in his belt loops and no particular expression on his face. I would like to discuss a fair arrangement, Briggs said to Martha, one that benefits both parties. I am open to fair arrangements, Martha said. The fair arrangement is that you honor the water rights as written in my deed, cease any further interference with the creek flow, and compensate me for the 3 months of lost water this past summer, during which my kitchen garden failed and I lost 14 head of livestock to the dry conditions. Briggs opened his mouth. In addition, Martha continued, I would appreciate a written acknowledgement that you instructed your men to confront me in the alley on the 14th of August, which I will be keeping on file in the event of any future incidents. She paused. If those terms are acceptable to you, Mr. Briggs, then yes, I would say we can get on to a better footing. The silence was very complete. Jonas did not move. Briggs looked at Martha for a long moment, and whatever he found in her expression, the absolute, unshakable certainty of a woman who knew she was right and had stopped being afraid of it, made something shift in his. He was a practical man, whatever else he was, and practical men understood when the math had changed. I will send a bank draft for the livestock losses, he said finally. The written acknowledgement is not something I am able to, the written acknowledgement or the Federal Land Commissioner's office, Martha said. I have both options available to me and I am prepared to use either one. The first is more convenient for both of us. Another silence. Then Briggs put his hat back on his head. I will have my attorney prepare the documentation by the end of next week, he said. I will expect it, Martha said. After he left, the store was very quiet. Then Martha turned to Jonas, and the composure she had maintained through the entire exchange cracked open into something much less composed, not distress, but the release of a very long tension, the way a body felt when something it had been bracing against finally gave way. She pressed both hands to the counter and let out a long breath that was half laugh and half something more ragged. Jonas moved without thinking. He crossed the store and put his hands on her shoulders, just gently, just to give her something to lean back against. And she leaned briefly, just for a moment, the back of her head almost touching his chest, her hands still flat on the counter. "You were extraordinary," he said quietly. "I have been waiting 4 years to say all of that to him," she said, a little unevenly. "I had it fairly well rehearsed." "It showed," Jonas said, "in the best possible way." She turned then, and he let his hands fall, and she looked up at him from a distance that was less than it had been at any point before. Her eyes were bright, not with tears, but with the particular brightness of someone who had been fighting a long time and had finally won a round, and who was allowing themselves to feel it. "Jonas," she said. "Yes. I am very glad you came to Caldwell Crossing," she said. "So am I," he said. And then, because something had become clear to him in that moment with a clarity that was almost physical, like the creek coming back clear and cold and true, "I would like to stay." She looked at him steadily. "For how long?" "That is something I would like to discuss with you," he said. "At your convenience. There is no urgency, but I want you to know that it is something I am thinking about. That staying is something I want." She held his gaze for a long, measuring moment. Then she said, "I am free for supper this evening." "I know where you live," he said. The smile she gave him then, the first full, unguarded smile he had seen on her face, the kind that reached all the way up into those sharp brown eyes, was something he knew, in the way you knew the most important things, that he would be able to call back to memory for the rest of his life. Supper that evening was different from the previous ones. It was not different in the practical details. The same plain dishes, the same warm kitchen, the same beans and cornbread, though Martha had added a jar of preserved peaches that she opened with the particular ceremony of someone bringing out something they had been saving. But the quality of the air between them was changed. Something that had been unspoken was now on the table, not spoken yet exactly but acknowledged, the way you acknowledge the presence of a thing by rearranging yourself slightly to make room for it. "Tell me about where you have been," Martha said. 20 years is a long time to be traveling." And so he told her. He told her about Tennessee and then Missouri, about the years after the war when the country was half ruins and everyone was trying to figure out what came next. He told her about Texas in the early 70s, when he had worked cattle for 2 seasons on a drive up the Kisham Trail, and learned the kind of things about himself that you only learned from months of hard work and bad weather and the company of men who were either the best or the worst of what people could be. He told her about Colorado, where he had tried mining for a year, and discovered that he did not have the patience for it, and also that he did not like being underground. He told her about New Mexico Territory, where he had worked for 2 years as a deputy in a small town with a name he had trouble pronouncing correctly even after living there, and about the particular brand of lawless that the territory produced in those years. He told her about the leads, the ones that had gone nowhere, and the ones that had gone somewhere almost useful, and then gone nowhere too. He told her about the woman in Arkansas who had answered to the name Turner, but had never heard of Jonas McCrae. He told her about the grave in Missouri, a Turner grave with no first name on the marker, that had stopped his heart for a week until he found the church records and learned it was a man of 70 who had died of a fever. He had not talked about any of this to anyone before. It was not the kind of story that lent itself to the telling 20 years of looking for a woman he had never met, driven by a promise made to a dead boy, was not a story that fit neatly into conversation. But Martha listened in the way she did everything, with full, unhurried attention, and the telling of it was unexpectedly like putting something down that he had been carrying for a very long time. "You gave 20 years to this," she said when he had finished. "Yes, because of a promise, partly," he said, It became other things along the way, but yes, originally because of a promise. She looked at him across the table with the preserved peaches between them and the lamplight warm on everything, and her expression was the most complicated thing he had ever tried to read. Thomas was lucky to have you, she said, even when he did not know it. He knew it, Jonas said. He told me the night before he left. He said I was the better man, and he just wanted me to know it before the war made knowing things harder. Jonas paused. I told him that was the most dramatic thing he had ever said, and he laughed and said probably. Martha laughed too, and the sound of it mixed with the lamplight and the smell of the peaches and the evening air coming in through the kitchen window, and Jonas McCrae thought, here, this is the place. 20 years of looking, and here is the place. He did not say that. It was too soon, and he knew it. And more importantly, she deserved time to decide, time to feel, time to let whatever was developing between them develop at its own pace, without being hurried by the intensity of his own certainty. Martha Turner had spent 20 years building something out of hard ground and harder circumstance. She did not need to be rushed toward anything. So he waited, and he stayed, and the days accumulated. October came to Caldwell Crossing with a change in the light and a sharpening of the air that made the Kansas plains look almost beautiful, the grass going golden and the sky going that deep, impossible blue that only happened in the fall. Jonas had by now become, without any formal announcement, a fixture. He helped with the store in the mornings and spent the afternoons doing various things that needed doing, mending fence on Martha's small livestock operation, which she ran with 2 older dairy cows and a dozen chickens and a pig named after the county assessor, for reasons that Jonas found deeply entertaining. He had also, at Martha's suggestion, started doing some basic carpentry repair on the store building itself, which was solid but had a few places where the winter was going to come in if nothing was done about them. He was good with his hands. He had learned carpentry during the years in Colorado, and the work had the same quality that other good work had: the narrowing of focus, the satisfaction of measurable progress, the way it quieted the parts of the mind that were too busy with other things. Martha would bring him water and sometimes coffee, and occasionally just come stand near him while he worked, leaning against the building or sitting on an overturned crate, talking or not talking with equal ease. He had noticed early that she was comfortable with silence, not the heavy, uneasy silence of someone who did not know what to say, but the easy, settled silence of someone who had spent years in her own company and had made peace with it. She did not fill space with noise. She let things be what they were. He found this deeply restful, in a way he had not known he needed. One afternoon in the middle of October, while he was replacing a rotten board on the store's east wall and she was sitting on the overturned crate with her mending, she said, without looking up from her needle, "Lucinda Baines has asked me, through the extraordinary medium of her husband's brother mentioning it to the blacksmith who mentioned it to me, whether you are planning to stay." Jonas set down the hammer. "What did you say?" "I said I did not know," Martha said. "Which is true. I do not know. What I know is that the town has noticed your presence and is forming opinions about its nature and duration, and I find that I care less about that than I would have expected to." She glanced up. "What I care about is what you actually want, not what you think you should want or what is reasonable or what the town thinks, what you want." He looked at her for a moment. "I want to stay," he said simply. "I have wanted to stay since the second day I was here, if I am being honest, and I have been fairly honest with myself about it since about the 4th day. I stayed because there were things that needed doing, but what made me want to stay was you." She held his gaze steadily. The needle was still in her hand, the mending forgotten. "I am not an easy person," she said. "I have been told that fairly regularly." "I had gathered," Jonas said. "I find it one of your better qualities." "I am set in my ways," she continued. "I have built my life exactly as I want it, and I am protective of that." "As you should be," Jonas said. "I would not want you otherwise." "I have been alone a long time," Martha said. "Not just alone in the sense of not having a husband. Alone in the sense of making every decision myself, depending on myself for everything, being responsible only to myself. She paused. I do not know with complete certainty that I want to change that. I am not asking you to change it, Jonas said. I am asking you to consider adding to it. There is a difference. She looked at him for a long time. The afternoon light was coming in low from the west, catching the silver in her hair, and the mending sat in her lap, and neither of them moved. I know there is a difference, she said finally. I have been thinking about that difference for several weeks. A pause, with a frequency that has surprised me. Is that, Jonas searched for the right question, is that a good surprise or a concerning one? And Martha Turner smiled again, not the full smile from before, but something smaller and more private, the kind of smile that was for one person only. A good one, she said. I think. They were not people who moved quickly. That was not what they were. But from that afternoon, things were different in the easy, quiet way that a creek changed after a rain, the same water, the same banks, but flowing a little fuller, a little more sure of itself. He stayed to supper that night, and every night after that. They walked together in the evenings when the day's work was done, along the restored creek or through the town, greeting neighbors with the simple social shorthand of two people who had become a unit without having formally declared it. The town of Caldwell Crossing, which had been watching with the focused attention of a small community that did not have enough variety in its entertainment, adjusted its impression of Jonas McCrae from passing traveler to intended, which was not precisely accurate but was not precisely wrong either. The formal conversation happened on a Sunday in early November, when the first frost had come, and the grass was stiff with ice in the mornings. They were sitting at the kitchen table after breakfast, and Jonas had his coffee in both hands and was looking at the window through which the November light came clean and cold, and he said, I would like to ask you something, and I want you to take all the time you need to answer. There is no hurry. Whatever your answer is, I will respect it. Martha had her own coffee, and she set it down very carefully, like she was making room for what was coming next. Martha, Jonas said, I love you. I did not plan to, and I know this has been a strange road to get here. Through a dead man's letter and 20 years of looking, and an alley fight that you had well in hand before I arrived. But I do love you, and I would like very much to marry you if you are willing, and I want you to know that if you are not willing, I think you are the most remarkable person I have ever met regardless, and my respect and regard for you is not contingent on your answer. The kitchen was very quiet. Through the window, a pair of sparrows moved through the bare branches of the cottonwood at the edge of the yard. Jonas McCrae, Martha said, in a voice that was careful and steady and carrying something underneath it that was not quite steady at all. I have spent 20 years not expecting things. I have been very good at it. I have made it into a kind of skill, not expecting things, not expecting fairness or ease or the simple human comfort of someone who looks at you like you are worth looking at. She paused. You look at me like I am worth looking at. You have looked at me that way since the first evening in this kitchen, and I noticed, and it frightened me, and then it did not frighten me anymore. She picked up her coffee and then put it down again. I love you too. I have known it for about 6 weeks and have been thinking about whether to say it for most of that time. A small, unsteady breath. Yes, I would marry you. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps, because 3 was all there were, and he took her face in his hands. Her strong, remarkable face with the silver at the temples, and the lines at the corners of her eyes that were the map of 20 years of surviving and building and refusing to be defeated. And he kissed her with the gentleness and the absolute certainty of a man who had traveled very far and arrived exactly where he needed to be. She kissed him back with the warmth and steadiness that was her particular and irreplaceable self. They were married in December of 1883 in the small Baptist church at the north end of Caldwell Crossing, with Pastor Ellery officiating, and approximately half the town attending on the grounds that this was the most interesting thing that had happened in several years. Martha wore a dress she had sewn herself from blue wool, which was practical and also beautiful on her, and Jonas wore the best of his 2 good shirts, and a jacket he had bought from the general store 3 towns over, and had to have taken in at the shoulders. The ceremony was brief and unremarkable by design. Both of them were people who found excessive ceremony uncomfortable, and they had agreed on something simple and honest, which was what they got. When Pastor Ellery asked if he took this woman, Jonas said yes with a straightforwardness that made the pastor blink, as though he had expected some hesitation and found none. When Martha was asked in turn, she said yes clearly and without any trace of uncertainty, and the look she gave Jonas as she said it was something that every person in that church who was paying attention would remember for a long time after. The reception was held in the dry goods store, with the shelves pushed back and a fiddle player from 3 streets over playing reels until the small hours. Jonas danced badly but with great enthusiasm, and Martha, who danced considerably better, guided him through it with the patient efficiency she applied to everything she decided was worth doing. At some point during the evening, Clem, who had apparently made his peace with the cast iron skillet incident and had developed a grudging respect for Martha's general approach to conflict, appeared with a bottle of whiskey and offered it in the spirit of community relations. Jonas shook his hand. Martha accepted a glass with dignity. Harcourt Briggs had sent a wedding gift, a bushel of winter apples and a letter written in a hand that was almost certainly his attorney's, formally confirming the restoration of water rights. Martha put the apples in the root cellar and framed the letter. The winter in Caldwell Crossing was cold and full, and nothing like any winter Jonas McCrae had spent in 20 years of moving. He learned the rhythms of the store, the morning inventory, the afternoon customers, the particular social geography of a small western town in which a dry goods store was not just a commercial enterprise but a kind of gathering place, where news was exchanged and disputes were mediated, and the ongoing business of a community was conducted over the counter with the passing of goods and the small change of daily life. He was good at it. This surprised him slightly. He had spent so many years moving that the idea of staying in one place and tending to the same things every day had always carried the theoretical boredom of the imagined. The reality was entirely different. The reality was that tending to things, the store, the animals, the building, the land, and most particularly the person he had chosen and who had chosen him, was not boring at all. It was the opposite of boring. It was the most engrossing thing he had ever done. Martha, for her part, was discovering the particular pleasure of having someone to talk to, not just anyone, but someone who listened the way Jonas listened, with full attention and without agenda, who had opinions of his own and was not afraid to say so, who could be disagreed with, and who disagreed back without it becoming a production. She had not known, in the long years of being alone, how much she had been talking to herself. She had not known until she had someone to talk to that the conversations she had been having were only half of what they could be. They talked constantly. Over meals, over the counter at the store, in the evenings by the fire when the winter dark came early and the wind was up outside, and the small warm light of the kitchen was all there was. They talked about the store and the land and the water rights case, which was moving through the courts in Wichita and was going well. They talked about Thomas, openly, honestly, not with the careful avoidance of two people managing a complicated feeling, but with the ease of two people who had decided that honesty was better than management. They talked about the past and the future and the small daily present, which turned out to be the most interesting of the three. In the spring, 3 things happened in fairly rapid succession that changed the shape of things in ways that were entirely good. The first was the conclusion of the water rights case in Wichita, which came down in Martha's favor in March, a formal legal judgment that affirmed her deed rights in perpetuity and assessed Harcourt Briggs for the documented losses of the previous summer, including the livestock and the garden. The bank draft arrived in April and was a genuinely useful amount of money, which Martha invested in expanding the store's inventory and adding a second room to the back of the building. The second thing was that Jonas, in the course of helping a neighboring farmer with a fence dispute of his own, discovered that he was genuinely good at the kind of practical legal and negotiation work he had done in the Briggs matter, good enough that the farmer told 2 other people, and those 2 people told 4 more. And by April, there was a loose but consistent understanding in the region around Caldwell Crossing that Jonas McCrae was someone you could talk to if you had a land dispute or a water rights problem or a particularly stubborn neighbor, and that he would approach the matter with intelligence and without drama and a working knowledge of the Kansas Land Office records that was worth paying for. It was not a formal profession. It was, in the terminology of 1884, the kind of thing a useful man did for the community, and it suited him profoundly. The third thing, which was the most important, happened on a morning in late April when Martha came out of the back room with a particular expression on her face, not the sharp or the calculating or the amused or even the warm. Something different, something Jonas had not seen before, and told him that she was with child. He was, for exactly 4 seconds, absolutely speechless. Then he crossed the room and took her hands and said, with a feeling that was too large to fit in his voice but tried anyway, "Martha." "I know," she said. "I am 43 years old. It is unexpected." "Are you?" He searched for the right word. "I am terrified," she said honestly, and absolutely, completely overjoyed. She looked up at him with the brightness that was not quite tears but was their immediate neighbor, both of those things at exactly the same time. "That seems entirely reasonable," he said. "I feel both of those things also." She laughed, a little shakily, and he held her hands and she held his, and outside the April morning was doing its warm and beautiful best for the occasion. The summer of 1884 was the fullest summer Jonas McCrae had ever lived. There was the store, which was expanding and doing well. There was his growing reputation as someone who could help with the kind of disputes that the formal law handled poorly. There was the land, which he had begun to genuinely tend in the way you tended land you intended to keep, not just maintaining it but improving it, extending the kitchen garden, adding a small orchard of apple and pear saplings at the south end of the property that would not bear fruit for several years, but that he planted with the easy confidence of someone who had stopped thinking in terms of next month and started thinking in terms of next decade. And there was Martha. Martha, who was carrying his child with the same practical efficiency she applied to everything, and also the occasional morning of being unable to stand the smell of coffee, which she found deeply offensive given how much she loved coffee, and which Jonas managed with great care, and the procurement of ginger from a passing trading wagon that he rode 3 miles out of town to intercept, because he had been told ginger helped. She had refused to slow down, which he had expected, though he had developed the habit of quietly making sure the heavier crates were moved before she got to them, which she pretended not to notice, and which both of them knew was a small and ongoing act of love. She was, at 43, healthy and strong and exactly as certain about herself as she had ever been, and Jonas watched her move through each day with the same wonder he had felt from the beginning, compounded now by the particular quality of watching someone carry something they had not expected and were doing beautifully. He was, he understood, the happiest he had ever been. It was not a dramatic happiness. It did not announce itself with noise. It was the quiet, bone-deep contentment of a man who had found the exact place where he fit and had the sense to recognize it and stay. On a morning in November of 1884, not quite a year after their wedding, their son was born. The birth was attended by the town's doctor, a capable woman named Dr. Sarah Holt, who had come to Caldwell Crossing from Ohio 2 years prior, and had established herself through sheer competence against the initial skepticism of a community that had not previously considered a woman capable of medicine, a skepticism that had eroded rapidly under the evidence of her results. She was also a friend of Martha's, one of the genuine ones, the kind you found rarely and kept carefully. The labor was long, and Jonas spent most of it being quietly out of his mind with worry in the kitchen, which he dealt with by making coffee, then making more coffee, then sitting with his hands around a cup and staring at the window until the sound of a baby crying came through the wall and he was on his feet before he knew he had moved. Dr. Holt came out with a satisfied expression and a streak of something on her sleeve that he decided not to examine. "Your wife would like to see you," she said. "She is fine, better than fine. She is, as I believe she has always been, entirely herself." He went in. Martha was against the pillows with her hair loose around her shoulders, and her color high and her expression, something he had no word for yet, and thought he might never find a word for the particular fierce tenderness of a woman who had just done something extraordinary, and was holding the evidence of it in her arms. The baby was small and red and intensely alive, fists clenched, face scrunched in the manner of someone who had strong opinions about having been relocated. "Come and see him," Martha said. Jonas sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, a small, improbable, entire person, with dark hair plastered flat and eyes squeezed shut, and Jonas's own jawline already, absurdly, visible in miniature on a face that was 4 minutes old. "Hello," he said softly, which was the most he could manage. "He needs a name," Martha said. They had talked about names briefly in the way of people who were not yet ready to make it too real. But now it was real, absolutely and entirely real, and Jonas found that he knew the answer with the same certainty he had come to know everything about this life. "Thomas," he said, "if you want, for his uncle." Martha looked at him and her eyes were very bright. "Thomas Jonas McCrae," she said, testing the shape of it. "If you want all three," Jonas said. "I want all three," she said, and the brightness in her eyes was, finally, tears, quiet ones, just a few, the kind that were not sadness at all. He put his arm around her carefully, not disturbing the baby, and she leaned into him, and the three of them sat in the early November light while Caldwell Crossing went about its business outside, and Dr. Holt drank the coffee Jonas had made too much of, and the world continued in its ordinary and extraordinary way. Thomas Jonas McCrae was, from the first days of his life, a person of very strong opinions and considerable volume regarding them, which Jonas privately felt was inherited equally from both parents and thus entirely predictable. He grew and thrived in the warm, busy life of the dry goods store, a child who learned to walk between shelves of dry goods and flour sacks, who was known to every customer by name before he was 2, who asked questions so constantly, and with such genuine curiosity that even the most laconic of the store's regulars found themselves explaining things to him with an attention they had not planned to give. Martha was a remarkable mother, which did not surprise Jonas because she was remarkable at everything she decided to do, but which still moved him on a regular basis: the patience and the humor and the absolute refusal to condescend to Thomas, treating him from infancy as a small person with thoughts worth taking seriously, which he appeared to appreciate and respond to with equal seriousness. The years that followed were good ones. Not perfect, no years were perfect, and the 1880s in Kansas had their particular difficulties: drought years and hard winters, and the ongoing tensions of a territory reshaping itself into a settled state, with all the injustice and displacement and complicated reckoning that entailed. Jonas, in his work as an informal advocate for local landowners, was increasingly aware of the ways in which the law protected some people and failed others systematically. The homesteaders who were cheated out of their claims by powerful interests, the people who had been on the land long before any American deed was written, and who were losing it through 100 different mechanisms that all came down to the same thing. He could not fix everything. He could, and did, fix what was in front of him, case by case and neighbor by neighbor, with the patient practical skill that Martha had once called more than persuasion. In 1886, Thomas got a little brother, born in the summer and named William after Martha's father, who had died in the war on the other side from Thomas, and whose death she had never stopped grieving quietly. William was a different child from his brother, quieter, more watchful, with Martha's brown eyes and a tendency to observe situations very carefully before deciding what he thought about them, which Jonas recognized as genuine good sense. The store grew. The land grew better. The orchard that Jonas had planted in 1884 came into bearing in 1888, and the first apple harvest was a small thing but entirely real. And Jonas ate the first apple of it standing in the orchard with the early morning around him and felt, as he had felt a great many times in these years, and never gotten tired of feeling, the deep and genuine satisfaction of something you had planted with the intention of staying to see it grow. Martha found him there, because she often found him in quiet moments of the day when they did not have to be busy. She came out in her coat with 2 cups of coffee and stood beside him in the orchard in the October morning light. "The apples are good," Jonas said. "They are very good," Martha agreed. She handed him a cup and looked at the trees, which were still small but solid, with the particular stubbornness of things that had been planted right and then left alone to become themselves. "You planted these the year Thomas was born." "I did. Thinking about the future," she said. "Yes." He looked at her. "I had a great deal to think about the future for." She looked back at him, and the morning light was in her eyes, and she was 47 years old and more beautiful to him than anything he had seen in 37 years of a life that had included considerable beauty. "Jonas McCrae," she said. "Yes. I want to tell you something." "All right." "When you came to Caldwell Crossing," she said, "I had made my peace with my life as it was. I had been alone a long time, and I had made it good, truly good, not just bearable. I was not waiting for anything. I want you to understand that." She paused. "I had made my peace. And then you walked into my alley, and you were quiet and useful and honest, and you looked at me like—" She stopped. "You know how you looked at me." "I know," he said. "I want you to know that I am grateful," she said. "Not in the way people say grateful when they mean something obligatory. I mean it the way you mean something you have thought about carefully for a long time and found it still true." She looked at the apple trees. "I am grateful that Thomas wrote a letter to his brother about a girl he had married. I am grateful that the brother was you. I am grateful that you were stubborn enough to look for 20 years. She looked back at him. "I am grateful for every single day of this, Jonas. Every ordinary, difficult, wonderful day." He set down his coffee cup and took hers from her hand, and set it down too, and he put his arms around her and held her in the October morning among the apple trees, her head against his shoulder and his face in her silver-streaked hair. And neither of them said anything for a long time, because there was nothing that needed saying that was not already being said by the fact of being there together. With the apples on the branches and the boys still asleep in the house, and the whole of the good known day ahead of them. The water rights case had been 1 year ago. Harcourt Briggs had retired and sold his operation to a cattle company from Missouri, which was a different kind of neighbor, but at least a legally registered one that answered to its shareholders in ways that made it less inclined to the informal intimidation that Briggs had favored. Caldwell Crossing itself had grown, not dramatically, but steadily, the way a place grew when it was well situated and properly tended, gaining a second church and a schoolhouse, and eventually a railway spur that connected it to the main line and brought with it new people and new business. Martha's dry goods store had grown along with the town, occupying now the full width of the original building, and a new addition Jonas had built himself in the summer of 1887, with help from Thomas, who was 3 years old and very determined to participate, mostly by handing Jonas the wrong tool with great confidence. The store had competition now. 2 other general stores had opened in the past 5 years, but Martha's had something the others did not, which was 15 years of community trust and the particular quality of a place where people felt they would be dealt with honestly, which turned out to be commercially valuable in ways that people who thought only in terms of price did not always account for. Jonas had, by 1889, built something that could be called a practice, though he would not have used that word. He was not a lawyer, had no formal training, and made no claims beyond what he could actually do, which was a great deal. He could read a deed and a survey and identify the problems in either. He could navigate the state land office with a confidence that came from years of direct experience. He could sit across a table from a difficult man and not be moved by the difficulty, which turned out to be rarer than it should have been. He charged what people could pay and sometimes less, and he refused work he thought was on the wrong side of a dispute, which occasionally cost him money and never cost him anything he actually valued. Thomas had started school in 1889 and came home every afternoon with more questions than a single day at school could possibly have generated, leading Jonas to suspect that the questions had been accumulating since breakfast and were only released in the afternoon. William, at 3, had decided that the most interesting thing in the world was the pigs, of which they now had 4, and was apparently conducting an ongoing relationship with them that involved long, one-sided conversations of which the pigs seemed to approve. On a Sunday evening in September of 1889, Jonas sat on the front porch of the house he had expanded twice now, the house that had been Martha's and was theirs, with the mark of both of them in every room and the mark of the boys in every scratched floor and dented wall, and approximately 14 pounds of dried mud tracked in from outside, and watched the last of the light go out of the Kansas sky. Thomas came out and sat beside him. He was 4 years old and very serious about things. "Papa," he said. "Yes." "Where do you come from?" Jonas considered this. "Tennessee," he said. "A long time ago. Is that very far?" "It used to feel very far," Jonas said. "It does not feel so far anymore." "Why not?" "Because home is not about distance," Jonas said. He looked at the door, through which the sounds of the kitchen came, Martha's voice, William's laugh, the domestic music of a house that was alive with people who belonged to each other. "It is about the place where everything that matters is. Once you find that place, the distance from everywhere else stops mattering." Thomas considered this with the focused seriousness of a 4-year-old who was taking it entirely literally. "Is home here?" he said. "Yes," Jonas said. "Home is here." Thomas nodded, satisfied, and leaned against Jonas's arm, and Jonas put his hand on his son's dark head and watched the last of the September light drain out of the sky and the first stars come up, one by one, over the Kansas plains. Martha appeared in the doorway. She had a dish towel over her shoulder and her hair loose around her shoulders in the way it was only in the evenings when the day was done and the house was theirs. "Supper," she said. "Coming," Jonas said. He stood and Thomas scrambled up with him, and Jonas held the door and Martha met his eyes as he came in, just a look, ordinary and daily and full of everything that did not need saying, and he brushed his fingers along her hand as he passed, and she caught them for just a moment, warm and sure. Inside, the lamp was lit and the table was set, and William was explaining something to the cat with great earnestness, and the supper Martha had made was simple and good, and Jonas McCrae sat down to eat with his family in the house they had built together and felt, with every cell and fiber of his unremarkable and extraordinary life, the whole and completed truth of it. He had spent 20 years looking for a woman he had never met, following a promise through half a continent, and he had found her in an alley with a cast iron pan and fire in her eyes, and the absolute unbroken conviction of a person who had decided who she was and was not going to be talked out of it. He had found her, and she had found him, and they had built something from the finding, something true and solid and daily and full, with children in it and arguments and laughter and hard seasons and good harvests, and the kind of love that was not a single moment but an accumulation, the way a creek accumulated from its 1,000 small springs until it was something you could stand beside and feel the depth of it, clear to the bottom. Thomas said grace in the serious way he did everything. William tried to feed the cat under the table and was told twice to stop. Martha passed the bread without looking up from serving, and Jonas took it from her hand, and their fingers touched, and she looked up, and she was smiling. Outside, the Kansas night was full of stars and the sound of the wind in the autumn grass, and the small sounds of a town living its ordinary life. Inside, the lamp was warm on everything, and supper was on the table, and everything that Jonas McCrae had traveled 20 years to find was exactly where it was supposed to be.